Around 7 p.m. on Saturday, August 13th, 2011, 19-year-old Wang Weijie was with his friends Ma Jun and Zhou Guo at an internet cafe in the city of Taiping, China, watching Jun play a computer game. Now, Weijie and his friends went to this cafe a lot, and today they had literally been there for hours by this point. But now, as Jun finished up the game he was playing, Guo announced that he was actually ready to go do something else now. So the three of these guys spent a lot of time together, whether it was at an internet cafe or elsewhere. They were like really close friends. And generally speaking, Weijie usually just did whatever Jun and Guo wanted to do, since they both had strong opinions, and Weijie was more of a go-with-the-flow type of guy. And so now, as Guo decided they were done with games, Weijie was just like, all right, cool. Well, why don't we just head back to one of our places just to hang out? But Guo, he shook his head and said, no way, like it's Saturday. They didn't have to be up for school the next day, and so they could stay out all night if they wanted to. And so he said, like, we gotta find something really exciting to do. Like, we gotta make the most of this night. Now, nobody had like a great idea of what was gonna be super exciting. And so Guo was like, all right, well, for now, like, let's just go outside and we can smoke first, and then we can go from there. And at this, both Jun and Weijie just nodded in agreement, like, okay, that's the plan. But in reality, Weijie wasn't really sure if he felt comfortable staying out all night tonight. Because tonight was not just a normal night. Like, this was an iffy night to stay out all night. So this particular weekend was not just an ordinary weekend. It was actually the area's annual Ghost Festival, a time on the lunar calendar when ghosts apparently would wander the streets after dark. And Weijie's family, along with his friends' families, and frankly, a lot of other people in this area, they took this festival really seriously. They believed the ghosts really were out wandering the streets after dark because they were just very superstitious. In fact, in this area, this festival was taken so seriously that businesses would often close early so people could safely make their way home before nightfall. Now, Weijie himself didn't really necessarily believe in ghosts, despite his family appearing to very much believe in them. But the reality is Weijie was just not a guy who ruffled feathers. He went with the flow. He was a rule follower. So in his mind, he was thinking, it's the Ghost Festival. Kind of don't want to stay out late tonight. But now, Guo was already making his way towards the exit with Jun, and so Weijie didn't bother to argue. Instead, he just followed right along, and they went outside to smoke. About an hour later, Weijie was sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with Jun behind the wheel and Guo in the back, and they were driving down a road in the outskirts of town. And by this point, the sun had set, and so now they were officially in Ghost Festival territory. Like, presumably there are ghosts out now out on the roads. So after leaving the internet cafe, the three of them, they had a smoke, but then as they're out there, they couldn't come up with a compelling idea for how to spend the rest of their big night out. All they came up with is, let's just get in the car and drive around and maybe we'll figure out something to do. Now, initially, when they hopped in the car, they're thinking, okay, it's getting dark out, we're gonna be driving around during the Ghost Festival, we're bound to find something exciting to do. And so all of them are they're amped up, they're in the car, they're pumped, we're gonna find something fun. But after a while, they were just randomly driving around. No one's really out because, again, it's this Ghost Festival. Everybody's, in their homes. There's nothing going on. And it just became really, really boring. They're just driving around and nothing's going on. And so at a certain point, Weijie is just feeling so frustrated because it's he didn't want to be out here in the first place. He didn't voice that to his friends, but he didn't want to be out here. He just wanted to be home. And so he just was man, this is so boring. And he just leaned his head up against the window and just decided to drift off to sleep. And so he's closing his eyes and he's just laying there, and Jun, who's driving, is just, driving along. They're not really talking. And so Weijie, as he's laying there, he suddenly feels the car come to a screeching stop. And Guo in the back seat immediately, reflexively screams at Jun, the driver, hey, what are you doing? Drive more carefully. And Weijie, he's looking around what just happened? And he looks over at Jun, who's driving, and Jun is not paying any attention to Guo or to Weijie. He's just pointing out the windshield at something on the road, and he's look! And so Weijie, who's just sort of confused because a moment ago he was half asleep, he looks from Jun out the front windshield to see what he's pointing at, and there's this woman who's just sitting in the middle of the road. They're out on the outskirts of town. There's no really any buildings around or anything. They're out in the sticks. and it's dark out, and everyone's home for the ghost festival, and there's just this woman sitting on the ground. She's wearing this floral dress, and there's a bike that she has that's next to her, just propped up. And she's almost been hit by a car. Like, they stopped very close to her. She's almost been hit by a car, and she's just sitting there staring blankly at the car. And so June, he's pointing at her like he can't believe it. He almost hit her, and Wei just like, what's going on? And Guo, like, he doesn't even know what to make of it. And at some point, June sort of snaps out of it, and he leans out the window and he yells at the woman to, like, get out of the way. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out of the road. But the woman didn't budge. She just sat there staring at them, just on the ground, not a care in the world, just looking right at all three of them. And so eventually, after sort of the tension in the car went down a little bit, June just pulled his head back in the window and he looked at his friends and he's like, I don't know. And he just drove around this woman, just avoided her, and they continued driving along. For the next few hours, the three boys just continued driving around town, looking for something to do, but there still was nothing to do. Everything's basically abandoned because it's this ghost festival night. Nobody's out, no businesses are open, there's nothing to do. And what really had not left any of their minds, even though they really didn't talk about it, was that woman. Like, that was so unusual to just see her sitting there, not reacting to nearly being hit. Like, the whole thing was just so creepy, made more so because it's the night of this ghost festival. Like, talk about the creepiest night to see something like that. And so eventually, around like 1 a.m., when the boys are still just driving around, someone in the car suggests, like, hey, let's go back to that intersection and see if she's still there. Like, let's just see what she's doing. Now, keep in mind, it's been hours since they've seen this woman, like hours. And so they drive back around, not really expecting to see her there. They think that, like, no matter how weird that was, she has to have gotten up and left by now. But no, they turn onto that road, which again is outside of the town. It's like there's no buildings around. It's dark, minus their headlights. And they drive down this road, and sure enough, off in the distance, still sitting in this intersection, is this woman. She's unmoved. She's just sitting there in her dress with a bike next to her, just hours later, no change. And so now it's like the boys can't help but feel really uneasy here. Like, this isn't right. Something's wrong with this woman. I mean, also they can't help but think, like, it's the night of the ghost festival. Are we seeing a ghost? Like, they're terrified. I mean, that's the reality, is they were scared. But really, more than anything, what all three of them are thinking and discussing in the car is, we gotta tell someone about her. Like, there's something wrong with this woman. What is she doing? Is she mentally unwell? Is she on drugs? We don't know, but like, this isn't okay. We gotta tell someone. But for now, the three boys decided that they had had enough fun for one night, and they drove to June's house, and they just all crashed there, determined to figure out what to do with this woman and what they saw the next day. And so several hours later, the boys wake up, they make their way into the kitchen because they can hear June's mom is in there making breakfast. And right away, June tells his mom what happened the night before. And as he's regaling her in the details of the story, June and Guo also chimed in with their perspective. And then after they were done telling June's mom, they all sort of expected her, being an authority figure, to know what to do. That she would very likely say, okay, we need to call the police, or we need to call a hospital, or we need to call some other authority figure and handle this professionally. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she just kind of looked at the boys and she said, you saw a ghost. Now, at first, all three boys were just shocked at how confidently and calmly she said this. I mean, of course they knew about the annual ghost festival. And of course, people in this town were very superstitious, including their own families. They knew this meant a lot, this festival. But the idea that we're going to sit here and literally say that the woman we saw sitting on the ground last night was a literal ghost, that seemed crazy. And the boys began saying as much to June's mom. But June's mom was just really annoyed with them and just basically shot them down and said, look, you saw a ghost, but like, that's the reason you're not supposed to be out on the night of the annual ghost festival. It's why the business is shut down. It's why we all go home before nightfall. You knew you weren't supposed to be out at night. You were. That's why this happened. Not to mention, these ghosts, they don't just wander around. They target people. You were targeted. Now, June's mother was not just throwing that out there. She was referencing one other aspect of this annual ghost festival that lots of people in this area believed. which was these ghosts that wandered around after dark on this one night of the year, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for people to effectively latch onto. And so part of the reason people believed you need to stay in at night and avoid being out after dark is because if you basically interact with one of these ghosts, they could latch onto you and then you become its target. In some cases, people believe it just produces really bad luck for you for potentially months at a stretch. Some other people say that once you've been targeted by one of these ghosts, they may try to kill you. Specifically, they may try to drown you. And so no one really knew, but it was like this belief that you just never want to interact with a ghost because it could be very bad for you. And so June and Guo, they still tried to argue a little with June's mother, trying to tell her that no, this could not possibly be a ghost, but their voices seemed less forceful now, and Weijia, he was sitting there thinking actually, if that was a ghost, this kind of makes sense. It explains why she didn't react at all to nearly being hit by a car. She just sat there. Also, why is she just sitting there? Strange activity for anybody to be doing. Maybe a ghost would do that. It also kind of explains why she was still there hours and hours later, just sitting in the middle of the road. Other cars must have gone by. This is not normal behavior. And so Wei just thinking, wait a minute, maybe this was a ghost. However, just as Weijia really started to feel almost sick with worry about, the seriousness of what had happened, he heard June's mom tell them, don't be afraid. She said, look, I know exactly what you need to do to stay safe. Later that same day, Weijia parked his car at a cemetery that was near June's house. And after he parked, he and June got out while Guo stayed behind in the car. All three of them were very tense. They were very anxious. And as Weijia scanned the headstones and looked over at a cornfield that was next to the cemetery, all he was thinking is this ghost woman is going to appear at any moment and she's going to do something to us. But she didn't. And so eventually, Weijia and June began walking down the path that would lead them through all the gravestones, basically deeper into the cemetery. So the reason these two were here and now walking into the cemetery is because they were following June's mother's advice for how to stay safe now that they had potentially come in contact with this ghost. And so they had gone out and acquired a stack of ghost money, and now they were going to go spend it. So ghost money is a kind of paper sheet in China that typically is burned when a loved one dies. The idea is when you burn this money, it sort of goes to the deceased loved one, and then they have money for the afterlife. You're basically giving your deceased loved one currency for the afterlife. But it can also be a way to buy protection from angry spirits. So Weijia and his friends have been told to burn ghost money over their family grave plots so that their dead ancestors could essentially pay the ghost, the evil ghost, to leave them alone. Now, they'd already done this at Guo's family plot in a separate cemetery, so that's why Guo was staying back in the car, and now they were going to do June's family plot in this cemetery. And so Weijia and June, they continue walking through the cemetery until finally they reach some of June's ancestors' graves. There, they knelt down, they pulled out their ghost money, and they began to burn the bills. And they're both just kneeling there, burning this money. And with each, bill that crumpled up and smoldered, both of them were feeling like this enormous wave of relief coming over them. And so for a little while, they're just burning their money, and they're both looking down at the money on the ground. They're just kneeling there. But then at some point, Weijia just looked up. And as soon as he did, he froze. Because standing right behind June can't see this, right behind June is that woman in a dress. And she's looking at both of them. And Weijia was so scared, he shrieked, he jumped up, turned, and started running in the opposite direction. Now June is so startled by Weijia screaming that he jumped up, ready to run away himself, but he's watching Weijia take off, and he turns around because he could tell Weijia saw something behind him, but there's nothing behind him. And he's thinking he must have seen the ghost, because why else would he react this way? But there's nobody here. And so June sort of put together, what's going on here? Weijia clearly spooked himself. We're in a cemetery after all. And he sees Weijia, and he's running, and he disappears into the cornfield that was next to the cemetery. He's just gone, just running, he's gone. Now, this cornfield was pretty massive. It had not been harvested, so the stalks were really tall. And clearly, Weijia was on a mission, and so June was not about to just chase after him. Instead, he ran back to the car and he grabbed Guo first, and the two of them went after Weijia. However, when they got to the cornfield and actually went inside of it, they quickly realized it was going to be really hard to find anything in this cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so thick and tall, it's so dense. I mean, every step was so slow and difficult, and they're calling out for Weijia, but there's no response. And so after several minutes of only moving, like 10, 15 feet or so into this cornfield, making no progress, the two of them are like, what happened to him? Like, either the ghost got him, or like maybe he's in hiding somewhere. Maybe he's convinced that the ghost is nearby and he's just being quiet and he's in hiding and he's somewhere in this cornfield, but we got to find him. And so the two friends, they back out of the cornfield and they end up calling a bunch of their friends to meet them at this cornfield and help them look for Weijia. So all these friends, they eventually arrive, and all day and into the night, these friends search this cornfield. They're looking everywhere for Weijia. Everyone's screaming his name, but there's no sign of him. 3 days later, and Weijia still had not been found. Now, by this point, the parents, Weijia's parents, had been told. They had told police. Police had looked for Weijia, but there was no sign of him. I mean, they were still out looking for him, but right now, like the talk of the town was, where is Weijia? Nobody knew. And so on this day, 3 days after the day that Weijia went missing, Jun was sitting in his room just feeling miserable. All he can think about is his friend and what happened to him. Like, he ran off after presumably seeing this ghost. Like, did the ghost get him? Like, all these horrible thoughts are going through his head. And Jun, as he's sitting in his room, he hears his mom call out to him, telling him there's a visitor. And so Jun, he gets up, he leaves his room, he goes to the front of the house, and he sees a police officer standing in the doorway. And this officer would tell Jun and his mother that they had found Weijia, and he was dead. His body was found in a lake that was not far from the cemetery, and that he had drowned. Jun is completely shocked. I mean, on the one hand, he sort of was expecting bad news at this point. I mean, basically everybody was. But to hear that his friend was dead was just horrific, and he really struggled to keep back tears. But, before he could really even react to this, the officer went on to say that, Jun, we spoke to Weijia's parents and they told us that you and Guo were with their son last, that you were with him before he vanished. And so we just want you to tell us, now that we know he passed away, that he drowned, we want to know what happened. What did you see? Like, what led to him drowning? And Jun, he just launched into the most detailed version of the story he could possibly think of. He took the officer all the way back to them at the internet cafe, playing computer games. They decide they're going to stay out all night. They go outside, they're having a smoke, they're talking about what they're going to do. They decide they're going to get in the car and just drive around. They're driving around on the night of this ghost festival. They see this woman, they think it's a ghost. Like, he went through this whole rendition of the ghost being really central to the story, and how the next day Jun's mom had said, oh, go burn ghost money in the cemetery to protect yourself from the spirits. They go to the cemetery and they're burning the ghost money, but then Weijia, he gets so scared. Jun's convinced it's because he sees the ghost again, this woman, and he takes off running into the cornfield. So he tells the officer every little detail. And he knew that even in a place like this, where people did, for the most part, believe in ghosts, he knew his story really hinged on a ghost made Weijia do this. And he knew that it was totally preposterous in some ways, but he thinks he's telling him the truth. And so he tells the officer all this stuff. And the officer's just staring at him, and he's clearly very skeptical. And then at some point, after Jun is done, and he's just waiting for the officer looks at him, and he asks him one question that once he answers honestly, it completely explains everything that happened. It would turn out that woman who was sitting in the middle of the road that sort of became the centerpiece of this whole ordeal was not a ghost. In fact, she wasn't even real. Because the three friends, Jun, Guo, and Weijia, on the night they decide to have their big night, they're going to stay out all night. When they went out for a smoke, they didn't smoke cigarettes. They smoked methamphetamine, which can cause you to hallucinate. And so they were high on meth driving around and hallucinated that woman. But they all, believed they saw it, and it felt so real, and it was on the same night as this annual ghost festival that it felt so real that even the next day, when they were no longer high, they still believed they had seen it. And then June's mom confirmed, yep, that was a ghost, because she believes in ghosts. And so they set out to the cemetery, and they're gonna, burn this ghost money to save themselves from these evil spirits. And what do before they head out to the cemetery? They smoke more meth. And Weijia, he has another hallucination. He thinks he sees the ghost, ran into the cornfield, not realizing that deep in the cornfield was a lake. He fell into it, and he was high on meth and didn't know how to swim, and so he drowned. And now let's get into our second story called A Wild Night Out. On the night of August 28, 2004, a 21-year-old named John Hutcherson leaned over a bar in Marietta, Georgia, and asked the bartender for another beer. John, by this point, had completely lost track of how many drinks he had had in the past few hours, but he was sure it had been a lot, because by this point the room was starting to spin. However, he had no plans to stop drinking anytime soon. After all, it was only midnight, which was very early for John, and he was having a great time, and the bar was packed, and there was loud music playing, and John was also on a winning streak, playing pool. And so while he waited for his beer, John looked over at the pool table. He had left his best friend Frankie there a few minutes ago, but now, as he was looking over there, he didn't see Frankie anymore. So John and Frankie had been very close ever since high school, and this night out they were having was sort of like a typical Saturday for them. Every week they would meet at this bar, they would get exceptionally drunk, and they would basically stay out all night. But on this night, they were both a lot drunker than usual, and now Frankie was gone. And so as John very drunkenly looked around the bar to see if he could find Frankie, he noticed a girl he didn't recognize at the end of the bar. She was very cute, and she appeared to be smiling at him. And so, John sees her and forgets all about his friend Frankie being gone and just smiles back at this girl. And then a moment later, the bartender hands him his beer, and John's feeling really confident. He takes his beer and he begins walking towards this girl. However, before he actually reached her, he felt a hand on his arm, and he turned to see Frankie, who looked just awful. He looked so pale, he smelled like vomit. And Frankie told John, as well as he could, because he's so drunk, he's mumbling everything. He just said he felt horrible, and it was time to go. Now, John was really disappointed, because even though he was really, really drunk too, he wasn't as bad as Frankie. Like, John had not reached the nauseous and vomiting phase of extreme intoxication. And so he's thinking, man, there are a couple more hours till closing, and I really want to talk to this girl. But he was Frankie's ride, and Frankie had to go home, clearly. And so if he was going home, John had to go home too. So John just chugged his beer, put it back on the bar, and then he turned and kind of waved at the girl, being like, sorry, I gotta go. And then John pulled his car keys out of his pocket. And so John and Frankie, they head outside to the parking lot, and John goes to his truck and he climbs into the driver's seat. And as he's fumbling with the keys to start the car, Frankie had gone around to the other side and stumbled his way into the passenger seat. And even though he's wrecked drunk, he's totally out of it, Frankie looks over at John and sees him unable to even start the car, and he's like, hey, are you sure you're good to drive? And John looks over at Frankie and he's like, of course, I'm just fine. I do this every single week. We always get home safe. And so at this point, Frankie's like, all right, whatever, let's just go. And so John, he eventually manages to turn the car on, he throws it in gear, and he began to pull out of the parking lot onto the road. But as he did, he really had to squint his eyes just to see the road clearly. His whole world is totally spinning because of how intoxicated he was. And then as soon as he actually began driving down the main road on the way home, the first thing he did is he's hitting the curb and swerving back onto the road, but he was, basically steady. He's totally wasted, but he's basically hanging on. And then the rest of the drive was just a blur. John was white knuckling it the rest of the way. He's driving along, he sees the gas station that he always passed on the way home, so that's a familiar landmark. He's going the right way. He eventually passes a familiar billboard, but then at some point his eyes snap back into focus because he realizes he's swerving off the road onto the shoulder, but he swerves back just in time to avoid hitting a telephone pole. And he's like, oh man, I got this, stay focused. And then somehow, some way, eventually he winds up in front of Frankie's house. And so he drops his friend off, and then back on the road he goes, navigating now at this point, like with one eye shut. And he eventually finds his way to his parents' house where he was staying. And from there, he climbed out of his car, he walked up the driveway, he unlocked the front door, and then stumbled up to his room where he immediately just fell into his bed and passed out. The next thing John knew, he heard voices, and then he felt somebody grab his arm and shake him. And then when he opened his eyes, his vision was very blurry, but eventually it came into focus, and he saw that he was clearly in his bedroom, in his bed, on top of his blankets, but he had no idea how he got there. He looked down and noticed he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they were sticky and they were dirty. And then there were also these two figures who were standing over him, repeating his name over and over again, almost angrily. John looked at these two and didn't really know who they were, but then he noticed they were both wearing matching uniforms. They were police officers. And these officers were very angrily asking John, what happened last night? Like, what did you do? What happened the night before? But John, he still is sort of trying to figure out what's even going on. He really doesn't have a good memory of anything that happened the night before. I mean, all he can just quickly remember is he was at that bar, he saw that girl, he drove Frankie home, he knew he was drunk on the ride home, but he got home. He didn't know what else they were trying to figure out about what happened the night before. And so when he finally opened his mouth to be like, what is going on? Because he was still basically drunk, it just came out of his mouth like this incoherent babbling. He was like, what's going on here? And the two officers, they were just over it, and they just grabbed John and literally pulled him out of the bed. They whipped his hands behind his back, they handcuffed him, and John, who's like, what is happening? They lead him out of his bedroom, downstairs, past his mom and dad, who are staring at him like, what is going on? And even though John, again, is basically borderline incoherent, in passing by his parents, he's hoping they're going to be like, hey, officers, why are you arresting my son? But instead, as he's led past them, he looks at his mom and dad, and they're not about to put up some fight. They're crying. They're holding each other and crying. They clearly know something bad has happened, and they can't stop what's happening to their son. And so the officers, they walk John in handcuffs out the front door, and they walk him over to his truck in the driveway. And when they got there, the officers just stopped and gestured for John to have a look inside. And so John, he's sort of looking at the officers like, okay, what's going on with my truck? And he turned and he just sort of squinted and looked through the window into the car. And there was this large object in the passenger seat that he didn't remember being there the night before. Then as he looked more closely, he realized with horror what it was. So the night before, John did drive when he absolutely should not have. He was clearly way past the legal limit for driving. He should never have been driving, totally unsafe for others, for him. Shouldn't have happened, but he did. He drove. And so he and Frankie, they're driving home, and John, in his limited memory, recalled, this sort of blurry ride home, where basically as dangerous as it was, he got them home. But at one point, he remembered almost hitting a telephone pole, and he swerved just in time, and he narrowly avoided it. And in some ways that was true. He did avoid smashing into the telephone pole, but he didn't avoid an incident. So Frankie, because he was so nauseous from having drank too much, he had his head out the window as they were driving along trying to get some fresh air. And when John drove too close to that telephone pole and swerved at the last second, Frankie's head was still out the window, and his head was decapitated by one of the tension wires coming off the pole. The tight wire that holds that pole into the ground, one of them, it's like a guillotine, and they're speeding past it, and Frankie's neck hit the wire, off went his head. But his body remained in the passenger seat of the car, and John was so belligerently drunk that he didn't see he had just killed his friend, nor did he see his friend's body, or a part of his body, still in his car. And so when John drunkenly arrived at Frankie's house, and he was like, all right, bye, he thought maybe Frankie got out of the car, but clearly he didn't. He was just there, dead, in his passenger seat. And then John just drove back to his parents' house and just left the car in the driveway with his friend's body inside, and up to his bedroom he went and passed out, having no idea what he had just done. A few months later, John would plead guilty to vehicular homicide, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On the evening of January 3rd, 1991, a 40-year-old mountain climber named Yi Song felt the wind and snow whipping against his face as he stared up at a mountain peak jutting through the clouds high above him. Yi was standing more than two-thirds of the way up a mountain called Kawa, which is the highest mountain in the Meilan Snow Mountain Range in southwest China. Kawa stands at an elevation of about 22,000 feet, which is more than 4 miles, and nobody in recorded history had ever reached its peak. In fact, the Tibetan villagers who lived at the base of this mountain believed that nobody ever would, and some of those villagers regularly tried to prevent would-be climbers from even trying. But Yi and the 17-member team of climbers he was helping to lead were determined to prove the villagers wrong, and to make history. They had started climbing this mountain a month earlier, and they were now closer to the peak of Kawa than anyone had ever gotten. Yi turned his gaze away from the peak and looked around the temporary camp where he and his team were planning to spend the night. He could see several climbers struggling to reinforce their tents against the snow and the wind. He and his team had chosen to climb at this time of year because it was known as the dry season, when major storms were actually rare. So Yi couldn't understand why the snow just kept coming down. He grabbed his radio off his belt and called down to base camp, which was a camp at the foot of the mountain where other members of the team provided weather information and support to the climbers. Yi told a base camp team member that the snow was still unbelievably falling hard up here. That team member reminded him that the climbers should clear snow away from their tents at least every 2 hours. Yi was about to respond, but just then, his radio cut out, and he heard this loud buzzing sound coming from it. He stared down at his radio, confused. This was the sound it made when it needed a new battery, but he had just put a new battery in. Yi fumbled with the radio, trying to fix it, but all he could hear was this buzzing sound, and then also, periodically, he'd hear the voice of the base camp team member cutting in and out. Yi communicated over the radio and wasn't sure if anyone heard it, but he said he was losing communication and he would try to contact them again later. Then Yi turned off his radio, clipped it to his belt, and the buzzing stopped. As the sun finished setting, the wind picked up even more. Yi craned his neck upwards again, and he saw that the peak of Kawa had now disappeared in the snow and the darkness. Yi had done lots of difficult climbs in the past, and he was sort of used to running into problems right when he thought he was about to achieve his goals. That was just how mountains worked. All the planning in the world could not prepare climbers for everything. But for some reason, this felt different. This storm just didn't show any signs that it would ever let up. Yi lowered his head and walked towards a group of tents. He wanted to help his team clear snow away. But all of a sudden, Yi heard screaming coming from inside one of these tents. He and several other climbers moved as quickly as they could through the snow toward the sound. They stepped into the tent, and they saw a woman laying in her sleeping bag, and she was shivering uncontrollably, and sweat was running down her forehead. Yi knew this woman, who was one of several Japanese climbers on their team, had been dealing with a high fever for days. But now, she didn't just look sick, she looked terrified. As soon as Yi entered the tent, the woman stopped screaming, and she just started muttering. Yi knew some Japanese, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He looked around the tent, and he could tell that the other Japanese climbers who had come in were also confused by the woman's words. Yi turned to one of them and asked, what is she saying? And in a little more than a whisper, the climber told Yi the woman was saying, "Something is coming." Later that night, the storm began to reach blizzard conditions as Yi made his way around the camp, checking on his team. As bad as the weather had gotten, and as alarming as the screaming Japanese woman had been, Yi refused to panic. He believed if everyone just stayed calm and prepared, they could make it through the night. But he quickly realized he was the only one who felt this way. Each climber Yi spoke to seemed as frightened as the woman with the fever. He tried his best to calm everyone down he spoke to, but nothing he did seemed to work. So eventually, he headed back towards his own tent to make sure it was secure. But before he got there, he heard more shouting. At first, Yi assumed it was the woman with the fever, but he listened more closely and he could tell it couldn't be, because it was a man's voice. Yi trudged back through the snow towards this shouting man's tent to see what was wrong. and when he stepped inside, Zhuryi felt truly scared for the first time since he'd come to the mountain. Inside the tent, Zhuryi saw one of the climbers sitting by a fire, pen and notebook clutched in his hands. And on his face was this wild look. His eyes were darting from one side of the tent to the other, and he would shout at something only he could see and hear. And then he would scribble furiously in his notebook. It was like he had lost his mind. Zhuryi was so unsettled that he just backed out of the tent, and as soon as he was outside, he turned and began rushing back through the snow towards his tent. However, as he was between tents, he heard this loud rumbling sound, almost like the banging of a drum, coming from high up the mountain. He froze where he was, terrified, and he heard the sound of trees cracking and splitting, and he knew this must be it. This is the avalanche. However, when Zhuryi looked up the mountain, expecting to see a mass of ice and rock barreling down the mountain towards them, all he could see was the falling snow and the black night sky. There was no avalanche. Early the next morning, January 4th, the snowstorm subsided, and the weather on Kawagabawa turned calm and sunny. A team leader down at base camp radioed up to Zhuryi to see how the climbers fared over the night, but Zhuryi didn't respond. So the team leader tried radioing the other members of the team that were up there with Zhuryi as well, but they too didn't respond. And so this team leader sent out a small search team to see if they could get a visual of Zhuryi and the other climbers he was with. However, remember, these climbers were thousands of feet up the mountain from base camp. So under the best of circumstances, it would have been really hard to look up and have seen them. And these were certainly not the best circumstances. There had been this huge snowstorm over the night, a snowstorm that really wasn't even supposed to happen this time of the year, which made getting a visual on Zhuryi and his team nearly impossible. And so this team leader quickly realized that if the climbers had gotten lost up on the mountain, he didn't have the resources to mount an effective search. So he quickly informed multiple government agencies that his team was missing, and then the government took over. That day, the Chinese government launched a massive operation on Kawagabawa. Professional search and rescue teams worked with volunteers on the ground, and airplane and helicopter pilots circled the mountain. But after 2 weeks of this daily intense searching, it became clear Zhuryi and the rest of the climbers, along with any remnants of their camp, had disappeared. On January 22nd, so 18 days after the climbers had gone missing, rescuers abandoned the search, and the government issued an official statement. The statement said that while massive snowstorms were indeed rare for this time of the year, they were not actually impossible to occur. So officials said the storm likely caused an avalanche that wiped out the camp and buried the climbers somewhere they couldn't be found. Now, this explanation was very logical, and for most people, it marked the end of this very tragic story. But not for the villagers who lived at the base of Kawagabawa. These villagers, who didn't think anyone would ever summit the mountain, and who actively tried to stop those that did, they did not believe the official statement. They had a story of their own, which they were certain was the real explanation for what had happened to the climbers. And when the government issued its statement, these villagers tried to tell people that the government was wrong. And so, when climbers and tourists from all over came to Kawagabawa, these villagers told them what they believed actually happened, and how it would happen all over again if anyone tried to reach the mountain's peak. Now, most people dismissed the villagers' story as rumor or superstition, and that was a reasonable way to react to this, until 7 years later, when 3 shepherds from the village made a terrible discovery. Seven years later, on the afternoon of June 18, 1998, 3 shepherds were walking along a glacier near the base of Kawagabawa. This glacier was 2.5 miles away from where Zhuryi and the rest of his climbers had set up their final camp. But the shepherds were not there to do any kind of search. This glacier was located near their village, and it was home to a temple that they often visited. So they were talking and walking towards the temple when, just up ahead of them, one of the shepherds spotted something bright and colorful sticking up out of the ice. The group was intrigued, and they began walking towards it, thinking it might be a prayer flag. But as they got closer, and this colorful object came into focus, the group went quiet. And then the shepherds also saw there were other colored objects just like this one scattered around the area. These objects were the bodies of the climbers who had disappeared from Kawagaboa 7 years earlier, still wrapped in the colorful coats they'd been wearing when they headed up the mountain. But what the shepherds could not have known in this moment was that buried under the ice with the bodies was a diary, which one of the climbers had used to record the events of the ascent. It belonged to the climber that Zhi Yi had seen shouting at an unseen force and scribbling furiously on the night they all vanished. And this diary would reveal that the stories the villagers told about Kawagaboa and the lost climbers were more than just legend. It would turn out there was a very specific reason why these Tibetan villagers believed nobody would ever reach the peak of Kawagaboa. It was because the peak was said to be a sacred place. It was the home of a warrior protector god, and because of this, it was not meant for human beings to climb. The villagers believed that if anyone ever approached the peak, it would wake the spirits of the mountain, and the mountain god would punish them. This punishment would lead to death, but it would not stop there, because the dead would become prisoners of the mountain for 7 years. And these villagers had made their beliefs very clear to Zhi Yi and the rest of his team of climbers who wanted to be the first people to ever reach Kawagaboa's peak. In fact, a group of villagers had heavily protested their climb and warned the climbers that their expedition would anger the mountain god and result in tragedy. But Zhi Yi and the rest of his climbers had not heeded their warnings. The diary of the climber that was discovered along with the bodies recounted what happened as a result. The diary started like a lot of climbing diaries do, an account of the day's hike, the scenery, the weather. But as the dates got closer to the night the climbers disappeared, the diary took a strange turn. The writer became obsessed with these shadows he saw walking across his tent, and he said he heard women laughing and babies crying all around him in the darkness. That woman who had screamed out, who was sick with a fever, had said she felt something bad was coming, and she had tried to warn the others. But by the time Zhi Yi heard the sound like beating drums high up on the mountain that he thought was an avalanche, like many thought was an avalanche, the mountain god had apparently already unleashed his wrath. As soon as Zhi Yi and those climbers had disappeared, the villagers all assumed that they had faced the wrath of the mountain god. But the fact that their bodies had remained hidden for 7 years, the length of time the mountain god keeps the dead imprisoned in the mountain, was all the proof the villagers needed to know they were right. And the climber who wrote the diary ended up believing them too, although it was too late. In his final diary entry, he wrote, quote, "We were wrong. They are coming. Run." In 2001, 10 years after the climbers had died on the mountain, the Chinese government banned all mountain climbing activities in the Meilin snow mountain range. To this day, still, nobody on record has ever actually set foot on the peak of Kawagaboa. Our next story is called Something in the Bushes. On a June day in 1953, a 31-year-old American doctor named George Moore stood in a small mountain campsite in Nepal, staring out at a massive rainstorm forming on the horizon. George had been in Nepal, which is a country south of China, for 8 months, leading a small medical team trying to stop the spread of diseases like malaria in villages all across the region. This was groundbreaking work in 1953, and it was starting to make George famous back home in America. And here in Nepal, he had already become a trusted figure among the villagers, many of whom had never seen a person from the West until they met George. But right now, a group of these villagers were scrambling to get George out of their village. And this was because of the storm that George was looking at. One of the villagers pointed at the clouds and told George this was not a regular thunderstorm. The monsoons were coming. And once the monsoons hit, the only dirt road that led back to George's base in the city of Kathmandu would flood very quickly. And the horrendous rains could last for months, which meant if George wanted to continue his work stopping disease in other parts of this region, he would have to get out right now. George had known the monsoon season was coming, but it had arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, and so he and his team were sort of caught off guard. The journey out of the village was not something they wanted to undertake suddenly with so little preparation, because they didn't have a car. They literally had to walk out, and so they needed to be fully prepared. And also, this dirt road out of the village went through a deep forest where the locals claimed it was inhabited by terrible monsters. Now, while George did not believe in the supernatural, he did think that, fantastical stories about monsters often started because of real-life animal attacks. And so, monsters or not, the forest was definitely dangerous, especially since they again would be on foot. But George knew they really didn't have any other choice. They did have to go right now. George quickly gathered up first aid kits, medicine, and supplies and put them into a large pack. Then he reached down, pulled a revolver out of the holster on his hip, and spun the chamber to make sure the gun was fully loaded. And when he saw all 6 bullets, he knew he was as ready as he was going to be. George holstered his gun, thanked the villagers for their help, and then turned to lead his team out. But as he stepped onto the road, one of the villagers grabbed his arm to stop him. Then they pointed towards a spot on the mountain above the road that George and his team needed to take, and George looked up and saw large billows of smoke rising above the trees and into the sky. In a strained voice, the villager told him that no matter what, George and his team must not go anywhere near where that smoke was. The storm continued to move in as George and his team began their journey. The men were getting wet and muddy, and the thunder was so loud it made their bodies feel like they were vibrating. But the rain really was not their biggest problem. Because by the time they had gotten maybe a mile or so from the village, a thick fog had rolled in and covered the entire road. And then suddenly, it was like the fog got so intense that George couldn't even see his team anymore. George did his best to try to walk as straight as he could, doing his best to stay on the road, but the fog at this point was so intense, he couldn't even see the ground, so he didn't even know if he was on the road. And then in the back of his head, he couldn't help but have this fear that because he didn't know where he was going and couldn't see his team, that he would unwittingly walk over to the place where that smoke was coming from. But he reassured himself that that couldn't possibly happen because the smoke looked really far away when they had set out, and this fog had only really rolled in for the last couple of minutes, so there's no way he could have gone all the way over there. But as George stumbled along, bumping into trees and feeling totally disoriented, the fog only seemed to grow thicker. The sound of the wind and the rain swirled around him, and George started to feel really disoriented, like he was in a dream or something. Then this horrific shriek cut through the pounding of the rain and the howling of the wind. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a wild animal, although George had no idea what kind it was. But George didn't need to know what this animal was to know it was a threat, and he needed to get away from it fast. So he turned and just began hustling in the direction away from the sound. But again, he could barely see. He was bumping into trees, he was stumbling on rocks. At this point, he knew he was well off the dirt road, but had no way of getting back to it. He didn't know where his team was, he called out to them, but didn't hear back. I mean, he's totally panicking at this point. And after a few minutes of trekking away from that shrieking sound, suddenly something huge and dark loomed up in front of George. For a second, he flinched, like somehow that shrieking animal had paced around him and now was stopping his way. But then he realized what he was seeing was actually this huge boulder. Frantically, he began climbing the boulder, thinking if he got to higher ground, he'd be safe from whatever was shrieking behind him. And as George climbed, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a member of his team. It was an entomologist. And amazingly, he was right behind George, standing at the base of the boulder. George just hadn't seen or heard him. The entomologist also seemed panicked and began climbing as well, and while he did, he shouted to George that he just heard movement coming from the plants. And so whatever animal was out here that this entomologist had also heard was clearly close by. George and the entomologist made it to the top of the boulder. They stood there, shivering and muddy, still surrounded by fog. George could feel his heart pounding, but he tried to hold his breath and not make a sound. The two men listened, trying desperately to hear any sign of this creature that had shrieked. But there was no more sound. It was silent. But seconds later, the men heard a new sound. It was like something was moving quickly through nearby bushes down below the boulder. George and the entomologist crouched down, trying desperately to see what was down there. And as they did, they saw the shadow run through the fog. On instinct, George put his hand on the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw, and now neither of the men moved a muscle. Then another noise came from the fog. George thought it sounded like grunts and teeth chattering. For a second, everything fell silent again. Then George heard heavy footsteps nearby. He started to shake with fear, but at the same time, he was desperate to see what was coming. So he leaned forward over the boulder as much as he could, trying to look down to see what this thing was. And suddenly, through the fog, he saw a pair of bright yellow eyes staring right back up at him. George tried to get back up, but it was like he was frozen. He just crouched there staring at the eyes in the fog. And slowly, he saw more pairs of yellow eyes appear in the fog. And he saw shadows of what looked like long tails whipping back and forth. Instantly, George thought of the monsters from the villagers' stories. But he told himself that's ridiculous. These were clearly just langur monkeys. He reminded himself that he was a doctor, a scientist. There had to be a rational explanation. These were just animals. They couldn't be monsters. But then one of these creatures moved forward and put its claw on the boulder and began to climb up. And at this point, George finally got a clear look at it. He saw this thing stood at least 5 feet tall, much bigger than any of the langur monkeys or any other monkeys that inhabited this forest. And instead of fur, it had gray skin. But most terrifying was its mouth, which was unnaturally large, stretching almost from ear to ear. And it was filled with these sharp teeth, the same color as its eyes. And as this creature slowly began to ascend the boulder, George felt a level of fear he had never experienced. Something primitive from deep down inside of him. A single terrifying thought blared in his mind. These creatures are not of the natural world. These creatures are godly. Now George screamed and drew his gun. He was too afraid to aim it at the creatures directly, so he pointed it up into the air and began shooting. The creatures let out a chorus of these horrible shrieks, the same shrieks they had heard earlier. Then he watched as the creatures turned, and their shadows and their yellow eyes disappeared back into the fog. George and the entomologist stayed huddled on top of that boulder, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. Those creatures did not come back, and eventually, the rest of George's team found him and the entomologist. The two men scrambled down from the boulder, and they joined the group. The team asked them what happened. They said that, George and the entomologist had gotten too far ahead of them in the fog, and they'd lost them. Then they heard the gunshots. But all George could say was, "We have to get out of here right now. I will explain later." And as the team set off again, George took a second and turned back around and looked in the direction of the boulder, where he and the entomologist had seen these creatures. And now that he had a little more perspective and the fog had cleared just a little bit, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. That column of smoke that he had been warned not to go anywhere near was coming up right from behind the boulder. He and the entomologist accidentally fled to the exact spot they were told not to go. That night, after a long hike, George and his team finally made it to their base. And it was only when he was back in the safety of his camp, with friendly villagers all around him, that George was able to finally think clearly again about what he had just experienced, with the strange creatures in that place where the smoke was. He didn't know what to make of it. George was a United States Army veteran and a man of science. He didn't believe in monsters or terrible gods roaming the forests. But he told his story as accurately as he could to the villagers, hoping they would have some realistic explanation for what the creatures were. But what the villagers had to say only left George feeling even more unsettled. So, George decided he was just not going to speak of what he had seen to anyone anymore. He had a bright future ahead of him as a doctor. He wasn't going to throw it away by making himself look crazy. And so when he got to America, and people asked him about his time in Nepal, he would tell them a wild story about this chance run-in with a group of langur monkeys. But the true memory of the creatures he actually saw out there, which were not langur monkeys, at least not to him, never left George. Their height, their yellow eyes, their huge mouths and sharp teeth, and the pure fear George had felt in their presence. George was a man of science, which made him want to forget this encounter. But he was also a man of truth, and so after spending years with these memories in his head, George came to believe that he had a duty to tell the truth about what he actually saw, no matter what the consequences were. And so in 1957, 4 years after his encounter in Nepal, Dr. George Moore published a first-hand account of what he had seen in a magazine article that was titled, "I Met the Abominable Snowman." In this article, he explained that the place on the mountain where the smoke was rising, where the villagers warned George not to enter, was called the House of the Gods. And the House of the Gods was home to the Yeti. A Yeti is an ape-like creature said to live in the Himalayas, and is similar to Bigfoot, but thought to be a bit shorter. In the West, the Yeti is often referred to as the Abominable Snowman. And in his article, George said he'd come face to face with a pack of them in Nepal. Telling the world what he'd seen did not adversely affect George like he'd feared. He went on to have a long, successful career and is still considered a pioneer in the field of medical outreach. And because of George's standing as a doctor and researcher, his encounter in Nepal has remained one of the most highly credible cryptid sightings in modern history. And so, as much as some explorers and scientists might think we can fully understand the natural world, both of these stories are proof that you can't.
You ever love something that hurts you gently? Yeah, the kind. You said my name like it was safe to stay. Soft tone hiding what you take away. Your smile felt warm, your silence was cold. I learned your truth and the things you didn't hold. I read your eyes like a warning sign. Still cross the line every single time. Touch my scars like you knew the code. Then blame my heart for the weight you broke. I called it love, it felt like gravity pulling me down, but it felt like destiny. I knew the damage still.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.